I'd like to talk about something completely different, or at least it'll sound completely different to start with, and then the plan is I'll link it back into why it's relevant. As a former banker, it's a subject near and dear to my heart, and that's value. And I want to show you that the concept of value, it's quite a nebulous concept, but there are a number of quite dry and academic tools that we can apply to it. So I want to walk you through those. I think it's important for you to understand the basic principles. You are all at a stage in your businesses where you won't actually be needing to run these analyses today, but the implications of them will underlying everything you are actually doing, whether you know it or not. So I'd like to run you through the concepts and then kind of show you why it's actually relevant. So you are not scientists anymore. You are entrepreneurs, and creating value is the primary goal of all businesses. And just because you're developing drugs is no difference. Therefore, being able to measure value is fundamental to how you make decisions, is what you're trying to do a value-creating decision. And that's relevant to, do you start your business, all the way through down to some very specific decisions that you're actually making every day. The underlying tool that we assess value in an economic sense is called a discounted cash flow. It's not the only tool you use, but it underpins everything else. As I said, you're not actually within the framework of OneStart. We don't want you to run discounted cash flows, but I want you to know how they work. So I'm going to talk to you about the basic analysis, and then there's actually a tweak that does make biotech a slightly special case that I'm going to go through at the end. And then I'm going to link it back in, as I said, to why it's relevant to a lot more than it might seem to start with. So, understanding value, measuring value, allows us to make all kinds of decisions. Everything that's kind of big, tangible decisions, like does Nike build a new factory? It will have a big upfront cost to build that factory. It will be able to expand its ability to supply more shoes and make more revenues. So when it analyzes the new value it's getting from increased revenues set against the cost of building the factory, is that a value-making decision? If it is, you build the factory. If it isn't, you don't build the factory. Down to really intangible things like an employee training program. You all go off, you kind of stand on tree logs and fall backwards and catch each other. Hideous. I've been on some. That's 3 days out of the workplace. You're losing that productivity. You've got to pay some organization who's going to run it. There's a cost to that. However, in theory, your team come back energized, more productive, happier. It impacts things like employee retention. You could be having people turning over every 6 months, and now actually they stay for 2 years. Offset the value creation against the upfront cost. Do it if it's a value-creating decision. But to be able to do that, make that decision, you've got to be able to assess what is the value that you're getting out the back end. Here's a very tangible example. I on purpose made it absolutely nothing to do with healthcare. This is Bill. He's a taxi driver. He drives for Uber, but he's also got a passion for carpentry. And on the weekend, he decides to make a table, which is what gets him excited. So he has some costs to do that, wood, tools, etc. As a result of doing this, he's going to not be driving a taxi cab. He could have earned, what did I say here? He could have earned £50 by driving his taxi cab in this time, so he's losing that. But once he's built his table, he's sold it on made.com. I don't know if you have that over here, but it's a place where designers can sell things. And actually, he ends up making £84 more of profit out of doing that. He gave up £50. It's a value-making decision that was actually a good use of his time, and he enjoyed it. So he gets to start thinking that maybe actually he should ditch Uber and go into the design business. So he, oh, well, hang on. First of all, I just want to talk to you about the vocabulary and the format in which we analyze economics, because this is the same analysis that I showed on charts, which is just your kind of standard pie charts. This is a profit and loss statement. So it's exactly the same information, but this is the format under which we communicate economic value. There are three main statements that go towards this. There's the profit and loss statement, the cash flow statement, and the balance sheet. I'm not going to go into that. That's an entire other lecture, but just to show you, VAT, that's sales tax, materials, labor, that's how much money he makes. He has to pay some rents. He makes £120 of operating tax. The government takes a big chunk of it, and he ends up with his £84 in profit. Hopefully that's reasonably straightforward. So he goes ahead and sets up his business. So instead of making just a single table and paying and making £84 profit, he actually goes in and makes many tables throughout the year. So in 2015, he built and sold 100 tables. And beyond that, he continues to keep doing that and grow his capacity. Maybe he takes on new people to help him do that. In the background, he's a startup. He's the equivalent of you guys. There are much larger design companies out there that the analogy would be a kind of big pharma company. They're always looking for new high growth companies to acquire, and they see Bill's company at a carpentry conference or whatever you do as a carpenter, and they actually think that's a really great brand he's built. It's high quality, people love it, it's growing fast, it's going somewhere. And they think, all right, well, maybe his business would fit very well with what we're trying to do. Maybe we'd like to buy him. So now they have to think about, if they do want to buy him, what's his business worth and how much should we pay? And if we did buy it, would that be a value-creating decision? So they need to be able to understand how much his business is worth. I've made all these slides quite dense on purpose. I'm going to talk through the concepts, but they'll actually and hopefully stand alone. So once you get to them after the lecture, you can read through them and email me questions specifically, but you should be able to make sense of them. So this column here, 2015, is exactly what the format I laid out before, except that he's making 100 tables. These are in thousands, I guess. So in 2015, having made 100 tables, he made 6,800 of profit. All I've done here is estimated of what his business is going to look like in the future. When it comes to valuation, everything that happened in the past is completely irrelevant. The only reason it's relevant is it might inform us as to what's going to happen in the future. So what we've done is built some forecasts around his business. So I've just said he's going to grow the number of tables by 20% in 2016. The margins, the costs per table, I'm going to say are pretty constant. And the implication is, having made 20 tables more in 2016 than 2015, his profit has gone from 6.8 thousand to 8.5 thousand. You continue to grow that out into the future. He's not going to stop after 2016. He's going to carry on all the way throughout, and I've driven this model out to 2025. You may notice that I've tailored down the growth. We started at 20% in the first year. By 2025, he's only growing at 5%, and that's typically what happens to businesses. You can't keep growing on a compounding basis. And so by the time you get to 2025, he's making 29,300 in profit. So that's what his business is forecast to do, and hopefully, this might be what he's thinking, but it might hopefully broadly tie into what the buyer who's interested in his business will assume as well. So how much is that business worth? How much is that stream of cash flows? Ultimately, in a world driven by economics, it doesn't matter whether he's selling tables, trainers, or drugs. The point is, at the end of it comes a stream of positive, hopefully positive, cash flows, and we need to assess how does that translate into value today. So what do we do? Do we add up this line, and that is the line of the assumed stream of cash flows? If we added them all up, you'd get to 190,000. So is that the value of the business? Well, it's not. There's two issues with it. The first is, we modeled it out to 2025, but he's not going to, well, whoever owns or whoever's running the company is not intending to close up shop in 2025. We always assume that these types of businesses are what we call a going concern. So they're going to continue into, in theory, infinity. But if you just carried on adding up the cash flows to infinity, you'd end up with an infinite number. So, that doesn't work either. But the key thing we haven't accounted for is what we call the time value of money. And its basic premise is that money in hand today is worth more than money promised to you in 10 years' time. There's a number of components to that. The first is risk. There's a risk that if I promise you $100 in 10 years' time, when you're looking forward to receiving your $100, I don't turn up. But the underpinning hypothesis is more than just risk, because you can get risk-free promises. If you take a promise from the government, if it's short of cash, just prints more cash. So effectively, as long as the government doesn't implode, and if you're talking about the US and the UK, hopefully that's a reasonably safe bet. So effectively, your risk on getting that $100 is effectively zero. The reason that $100 today is worth more than $100 in 10 years' time is what we call the opportunity cost. And that means, what could you have been doing with your $100 in the 10 years that you actually don't have it? So the most obvious thing you could do with it is put it in a bank account. Bank accounts, when you're talking about $100, are fully backed by the federal government, and so there is no risk to that money too. So if you manage to get a 2% interest rate, in today's world you're actually doing pretty well with 2%, but let's just assume you do. By 2025, it's worth £122. So if someone's promising you £100 in 2025, clearly you've given up the £22 you would have earned in interest. Does that make sense? And I'd rather have £122 in 2025 than 100. So invert that fraction, and basically money in 2025 is only worth 82% of the nominal value today. And so all you do is you gross up this 2% interest rate, invert it, and you end up with this, what we call a discount factor. So it's just compounding over the number of years to account for the compounding interest. So hopefully that's relatively intuitive. So we apply the same logic to the carpentry business. If you consider that you've got this stream of cash flows, which we added up to 190, but actually instead of considering it in the context of a going concern business, you actually just individually looked at those annual cash flows. So the annual cash flow in 2025 was 29,000. If you just said, okay, just imagine I'm being promised 29,000 in 2025, what is that worth? And then looked at what the 2024 cash flow, which was 27,000 or something, what is that worth? And you just segmented them into isolated single promises of cash flows. We can run the analysis across each of those, applying the same logic. The only difference is that this is a startup business, not a federally backed bank account. So there is a lot more risk. The business could go could go belly up 2 years later. So actually, we apply a higher discount rate, not 2%. We apply 15%. There's another reason of why that you end up at around 15% is, again, coming back to the opportunity cost. If you went and looked at the NASDAQ and found a early stage high growth company, that maybe was in the design space or maybe something kind of reasonably similar. But if you went and tried to find an equivalent business that you could have invested in on the NASDAQ, you will have found that the market was expecting a 15% return on the money that it invests. So therefore, your opportunity cost that you're giving up by investing in this business is 15%. It's the equivalent of putting it in a bank account at 2%, but it has a higher return expectation. The next thing is, as I said, we needed to account for the fact that the company will survive beyond 2025. And to do that, we make a kind of simplifying assumption about the growth of the company that goes into infinity. And we usually use the current inflation rate, that it basically just grows along with the economics of the economy. But because we're using this discounting technique, it becomes a rational number, not an infinite one. So this is the same chart I showed. So here are the same lines of cash flows, except that, and then here is this discounting analysis, except that this time we're using 15% as opposed to 2% when we were looking at your interest. As I said, these are a bit dense, so some of you will struggle to see them, but you'll have them to take away. So 2029, I think I do this, yep. So 25, we've got 29.3 thousand of cash flow. It's 10 years into the future. Once we've compounded a 15% return profile, you end up with a 25% discount factor. So your 29,000 in 2025, the promise of it is actually worth 7.2 thousand in today's money, because I could have gone to the NASDAQ, invested it in a startup, and in 2025 got £29,300. So you now add all of those up. That is the sum of these present values of those cash flows, which we get to 81,900. And then this is the calculation. I give you the formula, but it's quite straightforward. We just assume a perpetuity growth of 2% and discount that back to today, and you end up with 56. So you add the two together, and we end up as a net present value of Bill's carpentry business of 138,600. That was a little quick, but as I said, I'll leave you these slides, and you can email me any questions. So then what happens in the real world? We've got an assumption that Bill's business is worth 138,000. So what does the company who wants to buy Bill's business pay? Do they pay £138,000? No, they don't, because if they had, it wouldn't be a value-creating decision. They'd be exchanging one asset, cash of 138,000, for another asset of 138,000, no value created. So don't do that, and so therefore they have to pay less in order to create value. And how much less they pay is not really driven by kind of analytics. It's more to do with negotiation. How much does Bill want to sell it for? How many other options does he have for the business? How much do these guys really want it? And how many other how many other startups could they be putting their money on? Those types of dynamics tell you whether it's going to be worth, whether he sells it for 137,000 or 80,000. And that's more of a kind of dynamic process. So that's the fundamentals of value. Now we have to apply it to biotech, which, as I mentioned, has a nuance, which is a killer. So hypothetical situation, or hopefully not that hypothetical situation given the audience. Today you start your biotech businesses. Well done. Congratulations. Let's just assume you're planning to develop a small molecule cancer drug, and I know some of you are, so hopefully it's applicable to you, but the principles, as I said, will be applicable to others as well. So you're at the discovery stage, which, having read all your business plans, you are. It's going to take you, call it 10 years and about $200 million of investment to get through discovery, preclinical, tox, phase 1, 2, 3, and approval. And yeah, that's going to take you 10 years. But you guys are geniuses, and you have created a drug that is going to fundamentally change oncology, and you're going to end up with a product that sells £1 billion a year in revenues. Drugs and most innovation, to be honest, all innovation, you try to get protected by IP. The problem with IP is it expires. So you only have 10 years after you've developed it to make revenues, after which anyone else can copy your idea, and given market forces, they effectively fall to zero. So unlike Bill's carpentry business, there is no assumption into infinity. The principles are relevant just in terms of how you think about value creation, but you also should have them in mind, because if you manage to get through to a clinical proof of concept, somehow showing that the drug is safe and that it's doing something, when you're negotiating with a pharma company to buy it, or a set of investors who want to take it public, they will absolutely be doing this analysis. So you want to know what it is, because eventually, if you are successful, if the one person in this room who is successful, I want you to know at least what it is. The fact that the time value of money has such a big impact on this means that, in some respects, time is more valuable than money. And therefore, any delays in this process absolutely kills the value you are creating, which leads you towards always build contingency into your plan. Always think about what can go wrong, and if it does, what would I do about it to rescue the situation in as little time as possible. And it's usually the boring things. Your manufacturer goes bankrupt. Now you need to tech transfer your supply into another firm, and you've lost 12 months because without your drug product, you can't run a clinical trial. That's a hugely value-destructive event to have happened, totally outside of your control. Your board is not going to hold you absolutely responsible for that, but what they will hold you responsible for is the fact that you hadn't already spent time talking to 3 other potential suppliers who could step in if this goes wrong. So build a risk assessment and contingency into your plan to save delays. The other is, and I'm going to talk about this a bit more later, killing your program early is a value creative decision. As you see from the expenditures, the amount of money and time that you have to invest at every stage that you go through this process goes up exponentially. So if you realize in your heart that, we've put it in our first round of mouse models, we put it head to head with, an on-market drug, and although it seems to be doing something, it doesn't seem to be doing anything particularly more exciting than the on-market drug, even though our biological hypothesis seems to have worked. If it's not knocking the ball out of the park against everything else you could possibly do, ultimately, when you get all the way down the line, someone is going to say, so what? And your product is going to die anyway. So save time and everybody's money, so kill the program early if there's any way to do it, because you can then go and start your next company that will be successful. Platform companies. People talk about platform companies a lot, and we invest in a lot of them. The intuitive analysis would point you towards, if you've got an underlying technology, a new way to make antibodies against undruggable targets, for example, that company is worth a lot more than a single asset company that is just you are progressing into the clinic. And it is, and we like platform companies. But we tend to think of platforms as opposed to being technologies that are valuable in their own right. They are generators of products. So you have to analyze the value of the products that they are going to produce as opposed to the value and how sexy the actual platform is. Simeon's upset with me. But as we showed, going back to our discounted cash flow, that somewhere here, a drug that's in phase two is worth $500 million. And so generally, you won't run the 20 different opportunities your platform has in parallel. You run them sequentially. So your first product completes its proof of concept. You're in a great auction process with lots of pharma companies, and your lead product is worth 600. But if your next product is kind of going into the clinic, and it's also very exciting, you're going to make $1 billion of revenue, it's only worth 88. So actually, the incremental value that your platform element has given you is actually only, a little over 10% more. So what that leads you towards is make sure your lead program is not only a good proof of concept of the biological hypothesis that you're trying to prove, but is also inherently extremely exciting. I see a lot of businesses where they turn up and they say, okay, we've got an antiviral drug or mechanism we've identified. We're going to do it in flu first because that's a really, that's the basis of all the academics' work, and it may not be the most economically attractive market because flu vaccines or Tamiflu sells for not that much money and doesn't get given to many people, and it doesn't actually work anyway. But it's a great proof of concept, and if we can show it works in this, we can go after the really sexy stuff. The problem is the sexy stuff will be earlier and worth very little. So don't do that. Make sure you go for the sexy stuff first. And there are other ways you can de-risk things, but don't go down a path just because they prove your hypothesis. They need to be very interesting in their own self. The other thing is the fact that I've told you in every scenario that your company is going to earn $1 billion in revenues for 10 years. And it's still only worth $4 million today. And if you weren't earning $1 billion, it would be worth negative. So what that tells you is, if you're starting out today, only do something that's going to change the world. Pharma has a slightly has a slightly more cushion because it has a big infrastructure and it has existing products and it can do things like life cycle management, and that's what it's kind of been doing for years. And that game in itself is ending because of all the pricing pressure on the front end that you heard about just before. So what that means is, don't go after something that's incremental. You have to, if you've got a kind of pegylating technology that means you can take drugs from twice-a-day dosing to once-a-day dosing, that's just not going to move the needle, and you're never going to earn $1 billion from that. Therefore, don't bother. So hopefully that's clear. Yeah, we'll skip that one. The other one is this. We talked about the politics of it earlier. I wonder if I can zoom in. Yeah. This is just an illustration that highlights this impasse between kind of ethics, politics, and the realities of drug discovery. So I made these numbers up. I mean, I think they might be broadly in the right place. But if you think melanoma, there's 75,000 patients, new patients a year. The third-line patients who kind of haven't recovered, there's 25,000 of those. You've got a new drug for melanoma. I'll talk about this again later. Don't assume you're going to take 100% of the market share. 25% is pretty good going. So you have 6,250 patients that you can sell your drug to per year, and that's a pretty attractive return. For your drug to be worth anything at all today, the 4 million, we said you needed to make $1 billion in revenue. You do that very simple analysis. What that means is you have to charge £160,000 per dose or per patient for you to even bother making the value creation decision today to start drug discovery. If the cost of your drug, if it's a small molecule, is nothing. You could give it away for free and give it away for very little and still make a good margin. It might cost you £50 to make it. So if you sold it for £200, that's a very attractive margin. But the problem is, if that was the world we switched to, no one would make that value creation decision to ever bother with drug discovery. And I don't have an answer to that. That's just life, and it sucks. The only way to change it is if we could make the timelines to do it much shorter and the cost to do it much shorter, and attrition rates lower. So those are the three main dynamics. But until someone fixes that, we are stuck with this ethical, political, economic standoff. So as you walk around your lives, has anyone seen The Matrix, the film? Yeah. The first one, the second two are god-awful. There's a scene at the end where kind of Keanu Reeves becomes like fills his destiny, becomes the one. What I want you to do is walk around and see life for what it really is, which is just this complex interplay of value creation that's underpinned by your discounted cash flow analysis. So that's it.